Welcome to the Ghost Quilt Block tutorial by AndiJo Designs. It's a foundation paper piecing pattern. In the description below you'll find different time slots for different portions of the quilt block. Each unit will have its own spot so that you don't have to search through the tutorial to figure out what you're looking for. The first thing that you want to do is make copies of your paper piecing pattern and cut out each unit. So there are several methods of paper piecing. I chose this method because it's a cheap way to paper piece with just cheap copy paper that you copy your pattern onto, but this pattern will work on whatever method that you are comfortable with. Let's talk about fabric needs. For the ghost portion, you're going to need a 1/4 yard. Most fabric stores have a minimum amount of what they'll cut for you, so the fabric or the pattern calls for a 1/4 yard for the ghost. The background in this block is gray. It's also a 1/4 yard. You will have extra. For the eyes, you're going to need 3 2-inch by 2-inch pieces approximately, and for the bow, which is orange in this tutorial, approximately you'll need about 3.5 by 2-inch pieces. 2 of those is shown. So I use my reference page for a help guide, and I also label each section so that as I'm cutting my individual pieces, I don't make a mistake and cut the wrong fabric for that section. Okay, now that everything is labeled, I'm going to pull out my fabric for my ghost portions of the pattern. I'm going to lay down my paper pattern so that I know that as I rough cut each section, it is generously larger than the paper pattern. After I get all of my rough cut pieces cut, I like to stack all my pieces in the order that the pattern calls for so that as I go through, I know exactly which pieces for which section. And it makes the process go faster as well. So you'll notice that the black is first, so I'll stack that one on top, then my 2 smaller white pieces, and then my larger white piece, and I'll just put that away because I've done every fabric section in that paper unit. A helpful tip when cutting out your rough cut fabric pieces is to start off with your bigger pieces first so that when you cut off the little scraps from those bigger pieces, you can use those smaller scraps on your smaller pieces. Another helpful tip is when you have an odd shape section of your paper pattern or a triangle, I always use a rectangle so that I will be able to cover that entire odd shape on your paper pattern. So you'll see that here in a minute. You can see that some of these smaller pieces, that my scrap pieces from my bigger pieces, I'm going to use on my smaller pieces here. Okay, so now I'm going to put all my pieces in order according to my unit, and that way I know which rough cut fabric piece goes in which order. On this next unit, I've got some triangles that I have to cut out for the bottom of the ghost. And so I'm going to rough cut those into rectangles so that I know that they'll fit those rectangle pieces. You can see I just lay the paper right over the fabric and just eyeball it and make sure that it's generously larger than each section. Okay, coming up is one of those sections that I have a long triangle, so I'm going to use a long rectangle rough cut fabric piece to fit that long rectangle into that section. Okay, so I'm finishing up my white fabric needs, and I'm going to go into the background. So I'm going to put my white fabric away and pull out my background gray fabric and cut all the sections that are needed for the gray fabric. While I'm cutting these rough cut fabric pieces out, I'd like to talk about whether you should iron with an open seam or a closed seam. It really doesn't matter. There's a big debate on if you should have your seams open or closed. Some people think that the closed seams lock your seam in place and protect it. And then you have other quilters that say if you have your stitch length between 1 and 1.5, which you do on paper piecing, then you don't have any problems. We sew on a 1 to 1.5 stitch length for paper piecing. So something else that I recommend is getting a 1/4 inch sewing foot. I mean, if you don't have one, it works out still, but it does make things easier if you have a 1/4 inch sewing foot while you're paper piecing. That's just something that I recommend. Is it absolutely necessary? No, but definitely makes things easier. Okay, now that all my rough cut fabric pieces are cut, I'm going to use a straight edge cardstock and fold all of my paper patterns on the line. You don't have to do this all at the same time. You can do it as you go, but I find that it flows better if I just grab my cardstock and fold all those lines beforehand. Okay, our prep work is done, and let's get to sewing. We're going to start off with Unit A. Since this is not a paper piecing 101 tutorial, I'm not going to go into the details of paper piecing, but those of you that are new, this would be a good place to start and watch so that you get the idea of how it works. It's pretty simple. The steps are pretty much the same over and over and over again, except the way you line up your fabric on your first step. But other than that, it just is a repeat of the same steps. And so don't be intimidated by paper piecing. It's very easy once you figure out the basic 2 or 3 steps that you need to do to complete each unit. The nice thing about paper piecing is that you have all these rough cut fabrics, and you literally sew on a straight line on your paper pattern and trim according to your paper pattern, and it looks like you've spent all day lining everything up perfectly and spending a lot of time measuring and cutting, when really you've just rough cut it out and followed the lines on a piece of paper. So it's magic to me. I love it. Right, there's our Unit A. And on to Unit B. Now you'll notice that there's some odd triangle shapes on there, and you see that I have a rectangle rough cut fabric piece. That always works best with odd shapes, is to make sure that you use rectangle fabric, rough cut fabric pieces for those odd shapes, and then you'll never go wrong. With Unit C, this is pretty straightforward. It's following your regular steps. Just make sure you have all your pieces in the right order and you follow the right order on your paper pattern. This is one of those units that I love. It makes quilting look precise, and it makes it look like you've spent all day making everything perfect. With Unit D, just make sure your pattern has been folded all the way down the pattern instead of just on the line. It just makes it easier, as you can see. The only mistake that I've made on this piece is that I've switched my smaller white rectangular fabric piece and turned it the wrong way. I've done that probably 4 times since making this block, and now I'm to the point where I remember, but it took me 4 times to make sure that smaller white rectangular piece was pointed horizontally instead of vertically. So hopefully that might save you a little headache by putting that little white rectangular piece horizontally, not vertically. But other than that, this is a pretty straightforward section. Okay, in Unit E, there are several different sections in it, and you want to make sure that you get your first fabric in the right spot. You'll notice that I'm going to start off with the wrong fabric, and I'll realize that here in just a second. It's very, very helpful to write on your paper pattern piece which color or fabric goes in which section, because I've just read that and now I realize that I need to switch that. You know, if you make a mistake and you put the wrong fabric piece on the wrong paper section and you've sewn it, just get your seam ripper and just carefully pick it out. You don't need to reprint a new section unless you want to, but if you're just careful, you can just carefully use your seam ripper and pick it out and then just redo it. That's what I do, and it works out just fine. For units F and G, they're the same, so I'm just going to do one tutorial for this. You'll notice that section 1 is an odd shape. Anytime I have an odd shape, I always use fabric pieces that are cut in long rectangular shapes, so I don't have the stress of wondering if it's going to fit. I put my section 2 behind that. I can see through the white fabric that the gray fabric is 1/4 of an inch over that fold, so I'm going to pull that over to the sewing machine. Now you'll notice in a minute that as I pulled that whole unit over with the fabric, the gray fabric slid down, and there is not 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on the back of that. That can cause a weak spot in your quilt and even a hole. See that? And so let me show you that one more time. I'm going to trim that to 1/4 of an inch and then flip it over again to show you. Initially, I should have laid that white fabric rectangle piece there and trimmed it first, and then laid my gray piece behind it and then sewn it together. But there's a lot of times where I don't. I'll look through the fabric and line it up and sew those two pieces together. So if you end up doing that, it does create a risk that you will mess up on that seam like I did as shown. But if you're careful, then you should be fine if you ever do that. But if you do mess up, the paper piecing pattern does not need to be reprinted. Just grab your seam ripper tool and carefully pull out your seam, and then reuse that paper piecing pattern in your fabric pieces, and you'll be good to go. Okay, so section G can look intimidating. We have some odd shapes in sections 1 and 2, those long triangles. But we use fabric pieces that are cut into long rectangular pieces for those odd shapes, and it takes out the stress of wondering if we're going to cover those pieces properly. So just use long rectangular pieces, line up that fold 1/4 inch away from the fabric edge, sew on that line between section 1 and 2. And you'll notice that this piece that looks intimidating is quite simple if you just follow the simple tips and tricks, and then it will look like you've spent hours trying to be exactly precise to make this fit exactly right, when really those simple tips and tricks just make all the difference. For Unit I, it's the same instructions as Unit G, so I suggest going back to look at Unit G and follow those instructions. But I will remind you of the tip and trick for this. You have these long triangle shapes that you need to cover, so I always cut my fabric in a long rectangular shape so that when I have these odd shapes such as these long triangles or polygons, that I know for sure that they're going to cover it, and I don't have to stress and wonder if I have to sew and pick and take it out and try again. So remember that long rectangle fabric pieces work well with odd shapes such as long triangles or polygons. Now that our units are complete, we can tear our paper off. You notice that I put my thumb and support one side of the seam and pull with my other. Some might say that if you pull on that seam, it'll weaken it or break it. On your paper piecing pattern, there are little tiny circles that remind you to do a back stitch at all intersections. And so that strengthens your seam and it makes it stronger than ever and makes it so that when you pull the paper, it doesn't affect it at all. So remember to do your back stitches on your paper pattern as you sew and you come upon those. Just give one little stitch and then move forward on your line. So we can pull on that, not weaken it, and you're good to go. Hooray! We're almost finished. We're going to add the units together. If you want to just look in your paper pattern packet, these instructions are pretty self-explanatory, or you can finish watching the rest of this tutorial, but that's all that's left on this is adding those units together. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a happy Halloween. Happy sewing!